Good afternoon, and welcome to the Wilson Center. As I expect that many of you know, the Wilson Center is the nation's official memorial to our 28th president, and I am Jane Harmon, the not-so-new president and CEO of the Wilson Center. Woodrow Wilson was both a preeminent academic and scholar, and one of the leading statesmen of the 20th century. The Wilson Center seeks to bridge these two worlds to commemorate both the scholarly depth and the public policy concerns of President Woodrow Wilson. I think you will agree that today's program, looking at the always challenging problem of Pakistan, provides a good example of how sound, serious scholarship can speak to the needs of policymakers. And Pakistan does indeed present us with challenges. Pakistan's border regions, home to terrorists who regularly kill NATO troops in Afghanistan and plot against U.S. interests around the globe, have been famously characterized by President Obama as, quote, the most dangerous place in the world, unquote. I agree. Pakistan has the 7th largest army in the world. It will soon have the world's 5th largest population, larger than Russia. It is close to overtaking Britain as the 5th largest nuclear power. It is home to terror organizations for whom murder is a sacred obligation. And yet, we cannot and must not view Pakistan simply as a threat. A Pakistan well disposed to the United States could be a key political, diplomatic, economic, and security partner. And in fact, that is the history of most of the U.S.-Pakistani relationship. A hostile Pakistan, on the other hand, could throw up and has thrown up major obstacles to achieving important U.S. goals. The United States wants and needs Pakistan to succeed. Recognizing the importance of Pakistan, the Wilson Center last year organized a year-long effort designed to reinvigorate and reform the U.S. civilian assistance program in Pakistan. This effort led to the publication of a report that warned that the U.S. aid program was in danger of failing and offered 30 recommendations for U.S. assistance to get U.S. assistance back on track. Copies of that brilliant report are available outside the door of this auditorium, and I encourage each of you to take a copy. We are here today to help launch a separate report on Pakistan, this one by the International Crisis Group. The ICG is one of the most effective and well-regarded think tanks and advocacy organizations in the world. And ICG's president and CEO, our guest speaker today, is the Honorable Louise Arbor, who has achieved an extraordinary amount in her short life, with more to go, tackling the world's most difficult challenges. Before joining ICG in 2009, she was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights for 4 years. Prior to that, she served as a justice on the Canadian Supreme Court. For 3 years in the 1990s, she was chief prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunals for both Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. In that capacity, and I surely remember this as most of you do, she indicted then Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic for war crimes, the first time a serving head of state had been called to account before an international court. President Arbor has just returned from her latest trip to Pakistan and will speak to us about what she saw and heard on that trip, as well as share her thoughts on Pakistan's current constitutional crisis and its implications for U.S. policy. Following her remarks, she and I will chat for a while, and then you in the audience will be brought into the conversation. For the Q&A part of the program, we will be joined on stage by Mark Schneider, who heads ICG's Washington office. In another century, 1,000 years ago, Mark and I worked on Capitol Hill, he for Senator Ted Kennedy and I for Senator John Tunney. It was a halcyon time compared to the times now on Capitol Hill. We'll also be joined by Bob Hathaway, who directs very ably the Wilson Center's Asia program and who spearheaded last year's Wilson Center report on the brilliant one outside the door, that one, on the Pakistan aid program. Louise Arbor, we are delighted to welcome you to the Wilson Center, and I invite you to the podium now. Please welcome Commissioner, Judge, Justice, President, CEO, world rock star, Louise Arbor.
Thank you, Jane. Thank Thank you.
Let's move the.
Oh, yeah.
I know there's a way to do this so your whole head is not hidden. Let's see. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm delighted to be here. As Jane just mentioned, I was just last week in Pakistan. I decided to run to Washington because I couldn't stand the heat. Another of my clever moods. And I think when you're born in Canada and live in Brussels, you're not entitled to complain about warm weather. Let me just start my remarks with a disclaimer. I am not a Pakistan expert, and I expect there are some in the room. And I've had this bad habit since I'm now leading, as a generalist, an organization of specialists. I spend a lot of time with these disclaimers, making very clear that I really don't know that much about whatever it is I'm going to be talking about. And a friend of mine reminded me recently that these are not very credible, these disclaimers. And he said, don't you remember what allegedly Golda Meir said to Moshe Dayan? I said, I don't believe I do. And apparently she said, Moshe, don't be so modest, you're not that great. This disclaimer, as will become apparent, is very well founded. I am not a Pakistan expert. And the angle that particularly interested me in my recent visit to Pakistan, I'd been there in previous capacities, particularly in my human rights capacity. But this time, it was very much as a lawyer that I wanted to take a look at what was happening. And again, as a footnote, I could tell you, in my current travels for Crisis Group, when you enter a country, they give you these little forms, and there's a place that says occupation. I always find that writing president seems a bit presumptuous. So by default, I always write lawyer, which in a large way, I think still represents very much the take I have on a lot of issues. Now, Crisis Group, for those of you who don't know our organization very well, is a sort of 15-year-old organization born in the Balkans, pretty well, I think, out of a sense, a combination of outrage and despair that governments had done so badly at managing that particular conflict, and that there was a space for civil society actors, even in this very esoteric field of international peace and security. This is the environment that is usually left to Security Council, big players, state actors. Crisis Group, I think, has carved a very important space in that environment. We are a field-based organization whose mission is the prevention of armed conflict. So in a sense, it's again with great modesty that I will share a few thoughts with you on Pakistan, considering that we have people in the field, my colleague Samina Ahmed, who comes to Washington quite regularly and has considerably more insight and knowledge about the country on which we have been reporting for many years. Jane mentioned we have a recent report, I think there's some copies outside, on aid, particularly, not exclusively, but heavily focused on United States aid, development, and otherwise to Pakistan, and I'll say a few things about that. We also have, as of today, a new report on Mali. So for those of you who are as concerned as we all need to be on what's happening in the Sahel, I highly recommend this overview of what's happening with a standard crisis group approach, which is not only descriptive, but also prescriptive. I have a very simple message coming out of this particular visit in Pakistan, which is it is absolutely critical that we, and the United States in particular, focuses on civilian governance. And I'm particularly concerned with the current constitutional crisis in this emerging transitional democracy. The tensions between the judiciary and the executive in particular, but Parliament writ large, is very alarming. And it's, so I'll talk a little bit about this crisis, this constitutional crisis, which I think impeaches the democratic transition and puts at risk also a lot of kind of rule of law and governance future for Pakistan. And then I'll say a few things about US-Pakistan relations very much in that context, and in the context of our aid report. So again, on the assumption that not all of you, even those very focused on Pakistan, on the assumption that you may have not followed this constitutional tension in the role of the judiciary, let me just maybe give you a brief reminder. Again, speaking as a lawyer, in 2007, I think it's fair to say I joined the euphoria that many lawyers all over the world were sharing at what was then called the lawyers' movement. You recall that when the Chief Justice Chowdhury, was dismissed by Musharraf, the lawyers took to the streets in a somewhat unprecedented force for what seemed at that point to be the independence of the judiciary and the restoration of some kind of balance between the various branches of governance. So this lawyers' movement was somewhat unprecedented even elsewhere and was the source of, I think, tremendous excitement. Shortly after that, the National Reconciliation Ordinance in 2007 was put in place, which was essentially a political deal to quash a whole series of investigations or prosecutions into corruption cases targeting political leaders. This deal was brokered to permit Benazir Bhutto to return and for the launch of the broad-based political competition for the running of the country. The national ordinance was struck down by the Supreme Court in 2009, and from then on, I think we have seen the seeds of a very serious tug of war, I think it's fair to say, between the judiciary and the executive. So the judiciary decided that this quashing of investigations into corruption of political leaders, that this had to be set aside, and ordered Prime Minister Gilani to, and it's a level of specificity that is somewhat startling, to write to the authorities of Switzerland asking them to reopen an investigation into money laundering allegations against the president. The Prime Minister declined to write to the Swiss authorities on the, I don't want to say pretext because I think it is well-founded, taking the position that President Zardari had immunity in any event from prosecutions while in office. Now, this is not unprecedented. As you know, former President Sarkozy of France was the subject, according to the press, of the execution of search warrants and so on immediately after he stepped down from office. In any event, the court did not back down from its requirement that the Prime Minister commence this inquiry into the president, and the Prime Minister's failure to do so led in April of this year to his conviction by the Supreme Court for contempt of court. Again, a pretty startling position. The court used a particular provision, language in the Pakistani constitution that the Prime Minister had ridiculed the court, and yet the penalty was essentially that he was sentenced to the time that he served by his mere presence in the courtroom, that there was going to be apparently no other penalty. So some might have thought that this was the end of this showdown between the judges and the politicians. Well, it turned out it wasn't. The Speaker of Parliament declined to refer the matter to the Electoral Commission, which is the body that has authority to dismiss the Prime Minister from his functions or any member of Parliament from his ability to sit. So the matter looked like it was going to stay in Parliament. The Supreme Court was seized of the matter again and decided, and I won't get into all the legalities of whether they should have taken authority over the Electoral Commission to make that decision, but they basically decided that the Prime Minister had effectively ceased to be a Prime Minister and a Member of Parliament as of the date of his conviction for contempt of court. A new Prime Minister, now I pause here to say this also was, presumably a moment of great tension. The Prime Minister and his party presumably decided to comply with the order of the court. A new Prime Minister has been appointed, and the judges have now ordered him to write a letter to the Swiss authorities to commence an investigation to ask them to commence an investigation against the president. It may seem like political soap opera if it was not, in fact, against the backdrop of an emerging, new, struggling democracy that, behind the court, of course, is the long presence of the military. I don't think that there are many courts that would be so bold as to defy elected officials if they didn't think that there is considerable sort of power capacity maybe in the background. This is the part, I think, that is particularly alarming. If, in fact, we see an escalation of the tensions between the Prime Minister and the court, there are some possibilities of the court turning to the military for the enforcement of its orders. Now, this could be, I think, extremely alarming in light of the fact that there are elections, as you know, set out to take place in Pakistan by next spring. Many things could happen. The electoral calendar could be advanced. While I was there, I met with a Supreme Court judge whom I've known for a long time, who was the acting elections commissioner, Justice Jan. Meanwhile, a permanent elections commissioner has been appointed. The process is in place, but if this kind of tug of war between the judges and the executive continues, it is not impossible to contemplate the judiciary dissolving parliament with the help of the military and putting the process, in a sense, in abeyance for up to a couple of years, which I think would be, in all but name, a return to military rule. Now, this is not looming large. It's not necessarily the case. But I think in a country that is really struggling to establish its democratic capacity and credentials, this particular tension is very alarming. I myself found it very difficult. I gave a lecture to the Lahore High Court Bar Association at their invitation on this topic of judicial activism and judicial restraint. I come from a background where I'm not an apologist for judicial activists. I do believe that there's a place for courts to express, to read the Constitution and express the boundaries of the powers of the executive. I feel particularly strongly when the courts do that on behalf of those who essentially stand alone in front of the state. People who are accused, criminal defendants, or members of minority groups who don't have or feel they don't have adequate representation in the electoral democratic forum. That's where courts come into play. But when the courts exercise their privileged position as the adjudicator on an issue in which they clearly have a self-interest, that is on the separation of power, where they are called to express the limits of their authorities and that of Parliament and of the executive, I think considerably more restraint is appropriate to maintain, I think, the credibility of the judicial branch. It was, I think, fortunate, and I certainly won't get into American legalism or American politics, but I have to say it was hugely convenient for my purposes while I was in Lahore that the judgment of the US Supreme Court on the health legislation came down with the opinion of the Chief Justice, which was advancing exactly that point of view, that in constitutional adjudication, an important guiding principle is for judges to maximize not only the scope of their own authority, but that of the other branches of governance as well, to find a space in which all branches of governance, sphere of competence is advanced to its maximum. In a sense, an attitude of dialogue rather than confrontation. It was very helpful that I could use that as an example, as opposed to having to turn to much more confrontational jurisprudence in the relationship between courts and parliaments. There are a lot of other things going on in the courts in Pakistan that I think may render the court's authority much more fragile. There was the famous Memo Gate, as you know, in which the courts appointed a commission on a fact-finding mission with a lot of undertone, again, of protecting or maybe advancing military interests. They are charges that have been brought, again, in almost a soap opera fashion against the Chief Justice's son. So there's a lot of distraction in public opinion, all of which I think tends to reflect, in my view, very poorly on the judiciary, which appears from the height of 2007, where the championing of judicial independence was the big theme in Pakistan. Now we see, I think, a very serious politicization of the court. The bar, the lawyers I spoke to in Lahore were profoundly divided. Some still supporting the Chief Justice and the court. Others, I think, extremely disappointed at this extreme polarization and politicization of the court. So this is also in the context of a court that is not short of important work to do. I think the rule of law in Pakistan still requires a considerable amount of investment. I mean, particularly in the criminal justice system, and most acutely in the federally administered tribal areas where the enforcement of criminal law is essentially, again, very much dictated by the presence of the military, which I think needs to be brought under the supervision of the courts, with disappearances that are unaccounted for. Now, the court has done some work in that area, but we see, again, the same kind of paradox of a court that appears to be playing into the hands of military interests, and yet at times taking on military activities in the same way that I think we see the military at times appearing to support the United States and coalition efforts in the eradication of extremism, and yet at other times appearing to be very supportive of particular jihadi groups, particularly those who are linkable and linked to India and or Afghanistan, such as the Haqqani network. So we see tensions. I mean, nothing is crystal clear. Let me turn briefly to where that takes us, this constitutional crisis, and the question of U.S.-Pakistani relations. Again, to me, the signal is exactly the same, and this is very well, I think, fleshed out in our recent report on aid, which is that it would be highly desirable to see a refocusing on U.S. assistance, and particularly financial assistance, a shift from an overemphasis on military assistance to the civilian side, civilian law enforcement, support for capacity building in democratic institutions, in civil societies. I think it's fair to say that there had been a very severe deterioration of relationships, of the relationship between U.S. and Pakistan since 2011, a series of events, the bin Laden incident, the 24 Pakistanis killed in a NATO raid. A very, very low point was reached, and in fact, when I was there was an upswing to some extent with the resumption of the routes, the convoy, whatever they're called, the supply, the supply routes into Afghanistan. Now, this was received, I think, in public opinion. I think it's fair to say with uneven enthusiasm. There was a very large demonstration in Islamabad led by the most radical elements protesting the resumption of that relationship. Now, with this resumed relationship, I think will come increased exposure, danger, a lot of money that flows from the Coalition Support Fund. At least $1 billion apparently is to be released immediately now that this convoy route is reopened. All this, I think, while I assume in this country there's tremendous skepticism about the benefits of financial assistance to Pakistan, and the warning I think we give in our report is that this skepticism should not be addressed to the civilian side, that there is a long history, not just of United States aid, but of sort of generally Western donors' assistance everywhere, to very uneven assistance, easily withdrawn when things take a nasty turn of event, which is extremely not conducive to the building the long-term sustained building of institutions, which is what I think the nascent democracy in Pakistan needs. So we are urging in this particular report on aid a shift of emphasis towards civilian authorities, even if there's profound skepticism about the performance of the military, which up to now has been a major beneficiary of aid, particularly from the United Nations. We say, even on the security front, civilian authorities are a better partner, and they've proven with their very limited capacity to be a better partner for the development of a more secure environment in Pakistan. The civilian governments has made overtures to India in a manner that I think the military is not necessarily supportive and could easily derail. This is an initiative, it's a security initiative, it's an economic and political initiative that comes entirely from the civilian side and needs to be supported and nurtured. I'll say a few things on drones. It's, I think, very topical these days. It's very difficult, according to my interlocutors in Pakistan, to have an accurate read of what the public mood is. If you ask people, for the most part now, the mood is very negative. We hate drones, is the conventional wisdom. But when you talk to social scientists and people who know something about opinion polls and so on, they will say, frankly, it's much more difficult than that to actually ascertain what is the public reaction and whether the kind of hearts and mind agenda is being imperiled by the use of drones. It's what's in the press is not exactly scientific, and the Pakistan Institute for Peace Studies, which is a very serious organization, I think is skeptical about the assumptions that are made about the public reaction to this initiative. So on aid, as I said, we make a very strong call for support for elected civilian officials, which I think are currently in need of not just financial aid, but considerable signals of political support for elected officials, a shift from military aid to civilians, including for democracy and civilian law enforcement. There has to be enormous work done in the revision of the penal code, the code of criminal procedure. Lots of work has to be done. And it's very challenging, I think, for aid organizations to follow the trend in Pakistan, which goes, I think, in the right direction, towards devolution of more authority to local authorities, to provinces, particularly in the softer areas, but where the payoff is important in education, health, social welfare, areas where aid, I think, would be critical and more easily deployed, except that now that it is devolved to the local authorities, it's probably more difficult to determine. This is the message I bring back from this several days visit. It was mostly a visit with judges and lawyers and with a lot of civil society actors. On this particular occasion, I sought no meetings with government officials. The main purpose of my visit was, and I'll say it very modestly, to try to bring some senses into judges that I think were slightly intoxicated with their newly found independence and were at risk of putting in peril the entire democratic effort in Pakistan by potentially opening the door for a military, an increased military presence, which would be a tremendous setback in the country. Now, I bring this message to you. It's not the mainstream analysis, I think, of there are lots of other issues. I think in Pakistan, the looming of 2014, I think, is dictating a lot of strategies that are maybe very deceitful in the short term. But as I said, we see civilian authorities, and it's not a question of taking sides between the two leading political parties or others. I think the encouragement of policy making by elected officials at this particular point in the history of Pakistan, I think, is the way to go. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Louise, for a very interesting, politically astute, but lawyerly presentation of material. It's something I appreciate as a lapsed lawyer. Oh, there we go. Here I am. As a lapsed lawyer, and I bet this audience, which is very sophisticated about Pakistan, and I assume many lawyers among you, also appreciates. And that leads me to ask you, before we start a conversation, or as we start a conversation, a personal question. I was speaking this morning at the State Department to a group of graduates, about 60 women who spent the last 5 weeks in each of 3 women's colleges learning about leadership. These are women from all over the world, many of them from Africa, speaking of Mali, a place to keep our eye on. And they asked me what it was like in the dark ages as a lawyer to start my career, and how I felt, and was I the only woman in the room, and so on. And that's an obvious question to ask you. I'll just give one vignette that I told them, which is that my graduating year at Smith College, which is a women's college in Western Massachusetts, I decided as a government major and political junkie that I wanted to go to law school. So of course I had to take the law boards. Well, in the dark ages, Smith College didn't offer the law boards because girls didn't start legal careers when they graduated from college. So I had to go to Amherst, which is a men's college down the road, very nice place, that's now co-ed, Smith is not, to take the law boards. And I then entered Harvard Law School in a class where there were very, very few women, mostly men, and no women professors and so forth. And that sort of story continued. And just one last thing that Mark may remember. When we were working on the Hill, I became chief counsel and staff director of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights, first woman to hold that. And my senator, the chairman, John Tunney, said, well, we should go meet the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Fine. Made an appointment with Warren Burger, then the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. We go over to the Supreme Court, where I was actually a member of the bar. Had not litigated, but I technically had been admitted into the Supreme Court bar. And we get there, ushered through chandeliered room after chandeliered room. We finally get to the inner sanctum, his office, and he's there looking like he was sent from Central Casting. He was a gorgeous man with flowing white hair and his robe and so on. And he greets Senator Tunney, and then he looks at me and his mouth opens, and he said, oh, when you said you were coming with your chief counsel, I expected someone bigger. So I say that by way of introducing a lawyer who's even smaller than I am. And I think everyone would be interested, Louise, in sort of your early war stories about how you became this huge deal as a practicing lawyer.
Well, I'll just one thing that really struck me. When I was appointed to the bench, I was first a trial judge, then I became an appellate court judge, and eventually I became a judge of the Supreme Court of Canada. The first woman who was appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada, I think, was appointed in 1983, 1984. And her name was, she's dead now, her name was Bertha Wilson, a giant, a legal giant, a wonderful woman, a wonderful jurist. And when she was appointed, she has told the story many, many times. She got, in those days, I think they were telegrams. She was getting these messages from women all over the countries, turning to her and congratulating her and saying, we count on you. And she said she was very disturbed by that because as a judge, she felt she didn't represent any particular constituency. You know, what do you think I could do for you? And then she wrote a piece, she gave a lecture, wrote a piece that was entitled, Will Women Judges Make a Difference? And as is often the case, what is important is not the question itself, it's everything that's contained behind it, which is the basic question of, does it matter who the judge is? Some would say, well, no, you just apply the law. And you should be completely distanced from who you are. You know, your gender, your race, your upbringing shouldn't matter. Others, like me, are slightly more realistic about the fact that you bring to the bench not just a mechanical application of the law, but a reading that reflects who you are as a person. we're still very much, I think, debating this question. Does it matter that women are now occupying different places? To me, the fundamental, maybe most basic answer is that it's just a question of equity. So whether it would make any difference in what direction the law would take, I think it's unequitable to disenfranchise half the population and to deprive a community of half the talent that is there to contribute. But I suspect that there's more to it. I do suspect that women make a difference in public life, whether it's on the bench or in politics, on many, many issues. Whatever our personal background, wherever we come from, there are some things that we have in common with each other in a manner that's very different from men, including our relationship to violence of all forms. And there are many others, but that's one that's particularly striking, and our sense of security. In my travels, I go in all kinds of places. When you talk to women about security, I'm sure you see that as well. Terrorism is not the first thing that crosses their lips. Most women, particularly in developing countries, their sense of insecurity comes from their fear about their inability to feed their children, to care for them if they're sick, to get them the basic education that they haven't had. That's a security issue for them. So we are dinosaurs in a sense, but we are, I think, the first of a generation that has opened a space, not just for women, but for, I think at the same time, minority groups and others.
Here. Well, let's take a little survey of this audience. How many of you think that including the whole talent pool in education and the workforce makes a difference? Oh, good. Anyone who didn't raise his or her hand can now leave. Okay, so turning to Pakistan, and I know we're going to get into more detailed questions later, and Mark is going to come up, but there are questions you can answer. You focused mostly on the legal situation there, which I have to agree is troubling. And for those of us who lived through, some of you aren't old enough, but the Saturday Night Massacre event in this country where there were orders to fire a special prosecutor who was looking into the Watergate crisis, and person after person in our Justice Department refused to fire Archibald Cox, and those people then got fired, should understand what's going on in Pakistan. It was terrifying. And I actually thought we'd hear rifle fire in the streets, but our country survived it. It was a constitutional crisis, and we've had a few others, but that one kind of vividly leaps out in terms of the way I understand the situation is in Pakistan. Well, over the weekend, David Ignatius, who appears on a lot of our panels and writes brilliantly in the Washington Post, called the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, quote, the most neurotic, mutually destructive, friendly relationship in the world. That might apply to some marriages too, but whatever. I'm just curious whether you endorse that exact word formulation. Do you think it's possible for the U.S. and Pakistan to fashion a constructive or a more constructive relationship than we have? And I'm really not talking about just the U.S., but let's talk about the sort of Western community. And if so, how?
Well, I think for the next couple of years, this relationship will continue to be very bumpy. In large part, I think, because with the withdrawal, certainly of combat position in Afghanistan, I think there are very different agendas and very different interests at play between the ISAF coalition on the one hand, possibly the Afghan people, although I'm not in a position to measure their aspirations for their future, except that I'm sure they would like to see something peaceful and sustainable. And I think the interest that some with enormous means in Pakistan's have for the establishment of what they will view as a friendly regime in Afghanistan that will continue to serve their suspicion of Indian influence. And so I think for the next couple of years, it's likely to be a relationship full of tensions, in large part because I think this very, very central issue is going to pull in very different directions.
You have any predictions of what this relationship will look like 3 or 5 years from now?
Well, I suspect, and I suspect also that the Iranians feel the same way, that I'll call it the West, not to call it the United States, inevitably will always have if not friendly, at least a respectful relationship with nuclear powers. That's certainly one element. So I think it's a relationship that will always be, as all sort of foreign policy relationships, they're dictated by a convergence of mutual interest. It's not an altruistic exercise.
Right.
But I think relationships with nuclear powers, and a country that you've described earlier as a country that is growing, its population is growing, a country that has tremendous internal challenges to face, will be a major interlocutor for the U.S. and for the West, way beyond the short horizon.
I agree, and I also think there's a very positive side to the relationship. There's a huge U.S.-Pakistani community, and I assume even in Brussels, freezing Brussels, there are Pakistanis, but many Pakistanis are some of the most educated and talented, for example, medical professionals on Earth. They're not just nuclear scientists or terrorists. They're serious, functioning, important players in world health and our business communities and philanthropic communities. Large population of Pakistani Americans in Los Angeles, which is the area that I represented in Congress for 9 terms. And I just have to believe that those people have a huge interest in stabilizing this relationship, and that ways will be found, maybe it's my optimistic temperament, to get past some of these bumps. Judicial overreach is obviously a bump, a big bump. And one argument for it, I use the word overreach, so that maybe is a biased term, but is that civilian institutions in Pakistan are underdeveloped. The executive is not effective. The parliament is weak. So the judiciary arguably is filling a gap. Is that a way to see this that might be a little more friendly to what the Pakistani Supreme Court is doing?
It's very charitable. No, first of all, I think this description of the deficiencies on the civilian side of governance is not inaccurate, but it's largely attributable, I think, to the neglect that that the civilian side has suffered in comparison, for instance, to the catering of military interests. I think this is very clear. I mean, we say, certainly the rhetoric is all, we need to invest in the growth of democratic capacity, but when it comes right down to it, all the money goes to the military, not just the money, the respect. When it's time to reopen this supply route, the conversation is with the military, not with civilian authorities. All the signals are that despite this new emerging democratic capacity, the real power, the real interlocutors are there. Now, what it means, I think, for public opinion, again, in Pakistan, is that this relationship is entirely self-interested, and they will be long gone when their security interests have shrunk or if not disappeared entirely. So this kind of reversal, I think, is really critical, that there has to be very profound signals, not just by sending big checks, but by engaging with these somewhat dysfunctional civilian authorities that are largely dysfunctional because they're hugely neglected.
I agree, and I know the Wilson Center, our efforts to study this support what you're saying. This report we issued a year ago, which also generated an op-ed that Bob Hathaway and I wrote that was in the Washington Post, I think, strongly recommended increasing civilian aid, U.S. civilian aid for Pakistan, and we made a point that punishing the Pakistani people for the failure of their government is really makes no sense. There are some pockets of good news, and I say this based on my own trips to Pakistan. I was there a few years ago with our then ambassador, Ann Patterson, U.S. ambassador to Pakistan. She's now in Egypt. She sure has an eye for the calm, pleasant places to serve our country. And we were in Peshawar or somewhere. I think we'd just come from looking by air at the ravages of the biblical floods that had hit Pakistan a few years ago, and just devastating whole communities. And there was some rebuilding effort, and we met with the NGO community, and there were a number of NGOs like Catholic Relief Services, but there also was USAID there, if I remember this right, and a lot of the people from the region. And we, the U.S. and others, had just rebuilt some schools and some services. And Ann Patterson was asking for comment, and somebody raised her hand and said, "Why doesn't the U.S. take more credit for the good things that you do?" And yeah, and that raises a question, which we were discussing before about, and I feel this strongly, about our inadequate effort to provide a narrative for what we are trying to achieve in that part of the world. Not just Pakistan. I mean, it applies to other countries as well. I mean, what do you think about this notion? And it's not just U.S.-centric, but the notion of the need for a better narrative about what the West is trying to achieve in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and many countries. Some part of the Arab awakening, some just in the neighborhood.
It's very complicated. I think there's been an immense loss of credibility in the Western narrative. And again, I could refer to my work as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. The perception in the developing world, or the aid recipients, is of Western double standards with aid conditionalities, if not strict conditionalities, but sort of implicit conditionalities regarding improvement of human rights and so on. It's amazingly received with tremendous skepticism, that this is all a veneer, that it's, again, it's applied not in good faith. So I think the narrative has been lost, I think, to a large extent. It's very obvious, I think, in the European Union, in part because the aid agenda in the European Union, not in raw numbers, but I think in terms of its political footprint in the world, is possibly even larger than the U.S. That is, Europe engages more with development.
Yes, I do believe that's true. It's greater in the West Bank and Gaza than USAID is, and nobody seems to understand.
Yes, but even throughout Africa, there is less of a kind of military or political engagement. It's a very big development agenda, and even with it, you would think would come a certain amount of a quid pro quo, and that's, I think, again, tremendously lost. There's going to be a lot of effort, I think, in rewriting that narrative.
I think so. I think it's a huge missed opportunity, and something we'll work on together, our two institutions. It's now time to hear from you, and what I'm going to do is step off the podium and put Bob Hathaway in this chair. He said he has authority to speak for me, and we're going to put Mark Schneider in that chair. And I want to thank you very much personally for being here, Louise. You just grace this auditorium and the Wilson Center. It's a pleasure to have you here. Come on up. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
I have to share with you what my boss just told me as she was going out. She said, "Don't screw it up." I'm in fact going to stand up here because my really only role here is to recognize you in the audience. We will take questions. We have people with microphones. We will ask you to wait until we can get a microphone to you after I recognize you. We will then follow the customary rules. Please identify yourself. Please keep your comment or your question reasonably brief. And with that, I see the first hand in the very back and the second hand here.
Yes, my name is Kemi Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is that how to overcome the impression in Pakistan that US aid is nothing but bribe to Pakistani elite, and to get somebody before we, in the disguise of US aid, we got Osama bin Laden, and now we are trying to get their atomic toys in Pakistan in the disguise of aid. And my second question is that most Pakistani feel that they are being squeezed between India and Afghanistan. They were unable to defend their border from India for a long time, and now we have Indian big presence in Afghanistan, and that presence have put Pakistani Balochistan on fire. So unless we overcome these impression in Pakistan, how can we make this aid useful to them that they don't consider it bribe anyway? Thanks.
The question was not directed at anyone, so either of you.
Well, first, it's very difficult to answer this assertion that this is the impression in Pakistan. Is it the impression by everybody in Pakistan? I suspect not. So it's difficult to address something that is put as a fact, but may or may not be accurate. On the other hand, I think our report on aid points to, based on our own field-based research, that there is considerable skepticism, I think, in Pakistan vis-a-vis the consistency, the longer-term commitment that comes from foreign donors, particularly the United States, and whether this money is actually directed at the real needs of Pakistan to develop as a democratic country. I think that's probably a fair assumption, that there's tremendous suspicion that it's money directed at very immediate security interests, and that, for instance, post-2014, a lot of that may disappear. I think Jane was right when she said part of this is the narrative, but part of this is also the reality, that there has to be, or there should be, a rebalancing of international development assistance, much more geared to development as a form of security than to a narrow security agenda. And again, I think the support should go to the civilian authorities that are taking, I think, a much more enlightened approach to the relationship with India than the one that has been fostered by the military.
I'm not going to disagree with my boss.
Good.
I tell you what, Mark, I'll go to another question, and then if you want to amplify that first question,
Right.
answer in a minute, feel free to
Go
do
ahead.
so.
Go ahead.
Right here.
I have a question.
You want to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Munir Sheikh, and my question is that do you believe that the Supreme Court of Pakistan acted right in its authority to ask the Prime Minister of Pakistan to open the cases of money laundering and write to the Swiss authorities? As we all know, the accountability in that country is very, very poor. There is an established record of People's Party of corruption. It's rampant, and it's been proven. So that's my question. And my comment is that I think the problem with the aid that Pakistanis don't see U.S. as a reliable partner. And that creates a problem. And then they see that U.S. is helping those politicians who are ineffective and are highly corrupt. So that raises a real problem that the politicians are not solving the problems of the people, but they are filling up their pockets.
I'll answer the first part of your question, and maybe I'll ask my friend Mark here to address the question of aid. You asked me if I thought the Supreme Court was right in they didn't exactly ask, in requiring the Prime Minister to write to the Swiss authorities to reopen this investigation. There are many ways to look at it. You could ask me in a narrow sense, do I think that their legal analysis was correct in their interpretation of their constitutional powers and so on? I think judicial decisions are a mixture of, that's why it's called judgment. It requires part of it is wisdom. It's not just legal interpretation. In my opinion, this was not the right decision. I think the court, in a transitional democracy, I think recognizing the immunity of the head of state while in office, particularly in a system where one hopes that nobody's going to be in office in perpetuity, I think the wiser course of action is to let politicians do their work while they're elected and to make them accountable to judicial processes, including investigations into very important issues such as allegations of corruption and money laundering, that should take place when they step down from office. I believe that the limited immunity of heads of states and elected leaders is beneficial so that they could devote their energies to running the country while they're in office, and then they could devote their full-time attention to defending themselves against allegations of corruption when they step down. In Pakistan, I think this was amplified by the fact that this had been the subject of very important political negotiations that ended the military regimes of Musharraf and allowed democratic leaders to come back. There was an open competition between different politicians. In particular, I think courts, these particular judges who had themselves validated a constitutional environment in which, under a military regime, and had sworn allegiance to military regimes, were not particularly well placed to now take a view of their powers in a democratic system that I think is poisoning. It's distracting elected officials from the very difficult business of running the country and it's occupying, I think, public discourse in a disproportionate fashion. So I think the corruption agenda that you referred to, which is very important, could have been delayed by a few years and addressed at that time. And meanwhile, the courts had lots of other business to do than to be embarking in this confrontational adventure.
So your concern is not about the decision, but about the timing of the decision.
Absolutely. I believe that it is critical that politicians be made answerable, but I don't think that it was appropriate for the court to call on the prime minister to start an investigation on the president when the president, in any event, if this letter had been written to the Swiss authorities, you were embarking in I think in a public debate about the scope of his immunity. All this immensely distracting. It's just a question of postponing by at most a few years, which would have been, I think, a much wiser course of action. And
On the aid side, it's either there are 2 or 3 points I'd make that respond as well to the first question to some degree. One has to remember that over the course of the past 10 years, the balance between military and security assistance and economic development and humanitarian assistance has been 2 to 1. About 16 billion has gone for military assistance, about 8 billion for economic and development assistance. And also the criticism about corruption that you hear. One has to remember that corruption doesn't begin with civilian governments. Over the course of the previous several decades of assistance, if one looks at the trend line, one sees continuation of high assistance levels, in fact, when the military was in power, and lower when civilian governments came to power. And in fact, a lot of the corruption took place during those military regimes. So I think the issue is, how do you establish effective monitoring and self-policing mechanisms, both domestically in Pakistan and in other recipient countries where their civil society is involved in the process, and at the same time, how do donors effectively establish their own mechanisms for parallel auditing in situations where they're concerned about the use of funds. But it's not a civilian military issue at all. And second, it does seem to me that now our report says that it's necessary particularly to deal with the question that you had about reliability and to emphasize what Louise has said earlier, which is that it's fundamentally in the United States' security interest to support the elected civilian government in being able to carry out development services, development investments in ways that demonstrate support for the democratic transition that's taking place. And therefore, if there are criticisms, and there are legitimate criticisms with the actions of the military, or the lack of actions by the military in dealing with the Haqqani network, or in dealing with Lashkar-e-Taiba, or dealing with the other jihadi groups, don't take it out on civilian assistance, and don't take it out on civilian government.
Question back there and toward the back, right? It's on.
My name is Malik Sirajapur. I'm with the National Endowment for Democracy. During my fellowship project, I also learned from U.S. congressmen, representatives of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International that the Pakistani government was involved in misusing American assistance in the province of Balochistan, where enforced disappearances were being carried out and a kill and dump policy was unleashed. As a result of which, they said Pakistan qualifies for sanctions under the Leahy Amendment. What have been the ICJ's findings?
The question, that mic doesn't seem to be working. The question was about the disappearances and other human rights abuses, and particularly in Balochistan, and what the relationship of that is to the Leahy Amendment here in the United States.
In fact, the report makes quite clear that that's a very significant problem, that the disappearances that have been reported in Balochistan reflect actions, again, actions that were taken apparently by military authorities in that region. And that the argument that we made is that, and in fact the Supreme Court here has in fact called for the military to either present the individuals who've disappeared or information as to what happened to them after they were picked up by military authorities. And the assistance issue with respect to the Leahy Amendment is that no unit that is seen to have been engaged in human rights violations, obviously extrajudicial killings and disappearances are among them, can receive any U.S. assistance. And therefore the U.S. Embassy, together with U.S. authorities, has to undertake an analysis and review of the actions of the variety of military units that are going to receive assistance in order to ensure that the law is not violated. And here again, if there is a need to condition military assistance, do so and ensure that it's enforced vigorously. But don't take it out by reducing education or health or economic growth investment and aid to the civilian government.
I might point out, just as a matter of information, the Supreme Court has actually been very active on this particular front in a way that the Pakistani military feels it is being challenged by the court. So this is, to some extent anyway, an equal opportunity offender, the court is. All the way in the very back.
Thomas Pennington, and I'd like to ask a question specifically about the ISI, and considering that we've seen elements of that organization maintaining relations with militant groups that the Pakistani military and the United States government are officially fighting together, how could the civilian government bring those elements under greater control, and how could the United States assist in this process?
Well, as for the American assistance, Mark may have something to say, but again, the civilian governments can only get some control over military intelligence if it could start getting some control over the military altogether. I mean, we still have a very, very serious imbalance in the real power in the country between ISI and the military and civilian authorities. And as I said, it's really important. It's not just money, it's the validation of civilian power that has to be put in place. So if relationships, that is, day-to-day relationships, continue to be reinforced with ISI, with military players, this will not facilitate the capacity of civilian authorities, civilian law enforcement, civilian oversight, to be put in place. If Parliament continues to be disempowered by the courts and by foreign actors paying no attention, let alone showing any respect for elected officials, there's no hope that they will develop the capacity to bring their own extremely robust intelligence services under civilian control and civilian oversight. can't happen overnight, but certainly not going to happen if aid, financial assistance, and relations continue to be overwhelmingly imbalanced in favor of the military and the military intelligence.
The only thing that I would say with respect to your question is it should be very clear to everyone that ISI is part of the military. It's not separate from. And so it is, as Louise said, it's an issue of civilian control over the military, and ISI, in a sense, being ordered by the military to carry out not the military's interest in maintaining Lashkar-e-Taiba or Jaish-e-Mohammed as active players, but in fact supporting the civilian government decision to go after jihadi terrorists, whoever they are and wherever they are, and that both the ISI and the military should be following that policy. And that's one of the reasons why we argued in this report for moving more of your counter-terrorist support to civilian law enforcement agencies and strengthening their capacity to carry out investigations and prosecutions.
We're going to squeeze in just one last question. We're at the end of our time. This gentleman here in the third row. And I'm sorry for the other hands that I didn't get to, but we promised our guests we'd get them out of here in a timely fashion, lest they accuse us of violating their human rights.
Thank you for having me. My name is Mike Cromwell. I'm in Representative Dan Barnes' office, Oklahoma 2nd District. And kind of on the same vein as this gentleman in the back about the ISI, you kind of answered that question, but it's believed and it's debatable in many circles that Haqqani, or whatever, however you want to say it, I hope I'm saying it right, is supported by the ISI. And obviously, as an American taxpayer, you know, obviously it's not just about the military, but civilian help. Is there any kind of system in place that checks, hey, this amount of money is going to civilian aid, this amount of money is going to the military? I just read in this book here that Congress's reluctance with the military is obviously having problems with giving them more aid. And so my question is, how do you clean that up? And number two, what do you tell to American taxpayers that their money is going, they don't even know where it's going? It could be going to civilian aid, it could be going to the military. And if it is true that the ISI is supporting Haqqani, you know, the troops, our boys, our men and women are fighting or funding, you know, the same army that they're fighting. And so, you know, what do you tell to, you know, your constituents, your taxpayers? Thank you.
Can I start?
Well, since you're a taxpayer in this country, I think you may.
Louise, if you'd like to pay taxes, we'd be happy to accept them.
As a matter of
start.
fact, I do. Well, it's another issue.
I'll start. No, it's very clear. I mean, the answer is, first, we do know what resources go for military versus civilian assistance, number one. Number two, we know what kinds of assistance go to the military. That is, whether it's FMF or whether it's other kinds of support for coalition support funds. What we don't know is necessarily what the ISI and the military do with certain amounts of that money with respect to their support or not of the Haqqani network. I just would add that the law, the U.S. law, is very clear, and it states that none of these funds can be provided unless the Secretary of State certifies to the House and Senate Appropriations Committee that the government of Pakistan is cooperating with the United States in counter-terrorist efforts against the Haqqani network, the Quetta Shura, Taliban, etc. So part of the issue is, how does our government enforce the law as it exists, and what's the basis for any waiver that's given, national security waiver? And that needs to be both, in our view, transparent, and it needs to be publicly explained to the American taxpayer if you don't cut off assistance to the military for maintaining support of the Haqqani network.
Mark, am I right, though, that the Coalition Support Fund is not subject to this kind of...
It is.
It is as
It is
well? I
also
thought this
subject.
was supposedly a fee-for-service, and
But-
therefore the reopening of the supply routes allowed immediately $1 billion
But they're
to
still
flow without
supposed to comply.
I see. Good, then.
Well, now that
The
we've solved
taxpayers
that
will be
question, I regret we have come to the end of our allotted time. Louise, Mark, we are delighted that you presented some of your findings and unrolled your report here. We appreciate your work on Pakistan. It's an issue, as the last questioner rightly said, it's an issue that concerns every single American, and we applaud you for the splendid work you have done, not only today and with this report, but I've been a great fan of you all for many years. So if everybody here will join me in a round of applause now. And we are adjourned.